welcome to my channel. I'm Amanda and today I want to go back to my roots. Not really my roots, but something that I haven't been talking about or showing on my channel a lot recently, and that is watercolour. And I want to tell you everything that I know about watercolour. I have about 11 points here. That seems to be the sweet number for things that I know about things. And obviously there is a lot more to do with these mediums that I'm talking about. I just turned my computer off with my foot. But yeah, that threw me off a little bit. I won't be talking about the things that make up watercolour, like the binder or the pigments or anything like that. There are plenty of videos out there if you want to go and check out those to find out that stuff about watercolour. I'm just going to talk about general things that I've learned that I might want to share to make your watercolour journey a little bit easier. So the first thing I want to talk about is the actual paint itself. A lot of people say that when you're starting off with a new medium to start with the cheapest thing first and see if you like it. With watercolour, I didn't really like it when I was using cheaper materials, and that includes paper and brushes as well, but we'll get to that. With watercolour paint, yes, the thing that you need to cheap out on if you want to cheap out on anything is watercolours, because there are a wide variety of different grades of watercolours that you could use. There's the ones for kids, like the chalky pan watercolours that you get from Crayola and Artist Loft, and they're usually in these palettes with circles and they're in little cake forms. Those are the ones that you want to avoid. But other than that, if you get a decent student grade brand of watercolour paints, then you will generally have a good time. But obviously the highest that you can go in quality, depending on your budget, is the best. But again, quality is not really important with the paints as it is for paper. Paper is important. If you want to have a good time with watercolour paper, you're not going to have a good time if you try and paint on sketchbook paper or printer paper or any sort of really thin paper. You need to have a paper that will handle the watercolour as well as the water and make it so that it doesn't crumble or warp or anything like that. A lot of people use the brand ALLJArt. Don't know how to say that, but it's a really expensive paper, and I don't think that you have to go that expensive. There are papers out there that are awesome to use, and I have actually did a comparison of papers if you want to go and check that out, watercolour papers. So those things will help you decide what kind of paper you want, but I don't use 100% cotton watercolour paper most of the time because it's too expensive, but it is amazing to use. You will be blown away if you use it. And that's the same thing with professional paints. They're such a pleasure to use, and the properties of the paint do really affect the way that you feel about watercolours. For example, I let my son use a student grade watercolour compared to his Crayola ones, and he was blown away. He was like, whoa, when the effects started happening with the dearer brand of watercolours. And talking about supplies, let's just go into the brushes. And I think that the softer the brush, the better. The more water the brush can retain, the more paint the brush can retain is the better choice. So don't buy multi-purpose brushes. You can buy a pack of multi-purpose brushes and they will work, but for a better experience, I would probably buy a more expensive watercolour brush. You don't have to have loads of them. You can just buy one, probably around a 6 or an 8, so that you can get wider washes of colour, but you can also get intricate details. I mainly use a 6, and I have a 8 or a 10 or a 12 for my thicker brushes because I prefer to use a thinner one. And I also have a longer rigger brush, they're called, that you can get straight lines with, really thin straight lines with, but you don't need to go all out on the brushes to start with. As long as they don't have brush bristles falling out and they are soft, they should do the job. Most watercolors are transparent, and that gives you the ability to layer and glaze. Glazing is one of my favourite things to do with watercolor. You wait until the layer that you have just put down has dried, and then you get another batch of watercolor on your paintbrush. It doesn't have to be the same colour, but I like to do this with the same colour and with shadow colours such as purple or blue, and you can layer it on to make the paint sort of a layer. But since they're transparent, then the colours below will show through and it'll make it beautiful and lovely to work with. And I like this because it's better to control. It's easier to control where your paint is going, because if you put down maybe a line of watercolour and then you get water and start colouring or start putting on the water from the place that you want the colour to end and gradually sneak up to it and touch it, the watercolour will flow into the water that you have placed down. So it makes it much nicer to work with because it's controlled. Whereas with wet and wet, it kind of just blends all together and you can't really control it as much. But it is a good technique to use, which brings me to my other point, which is that effects are easier to get with watercolour because you can use different techniques such as glazing, like I mentioned, the wet and wet technique, which is basically just putting wet watercolour down and then putting more wet watercolour into that and letting them do their thing, blossom and blend together. Sometimes it creates cauliflowers, as they're called, because you need to wait for a certain amount of time for it to take well, and you can't wait too long. So watercolors are really scary to think about using to start with, because you're like, oh, how long do I wait for this to dry? Do I wait for it to dry, and what to do? But basically just get a scrap piece of paper of watercolor and experiment with them and see what kind of effects you can get. Other effects that you can create are cool to use are like if you use sea salt to soak up the colour around about the salt, and then when you scrape off the salt afterwards you get really cool effects left behind. And there is also the other effect, which is cling film. There's plenty more of them, but these are my favourite ones. If you have a wet patch of watercolour and you want to create some sort of texture in your paint, you can put down cling film and it will create cool effects as well. So just play about with effects and see what you can come up with. You don't have to use them in your watercolours if you like your watercolours to be a little bit more flat, but they are fun things to do. Going back to the paint for a second, I used to just use pan watercolours. I keep on going to say pan pastels because that's on my mind for some reason, but pan watercolours. So those are the watercolours that are dried out, already put in a pan, and you can use water to reactivate them and then use them out of the pan. But as I was getting more and more into watercolour, I realised that actually using the tubes was a better way to go. You could just put out a little bit and you can use it like that. And then the fresher the paint, the better, because the more vibrant you can go and you don't have to continuously wet them and soak them and try and scrub them to try and get the pigment off. But obviously it depends on the brand that you have. I think Holbein and M. Graham and even Schminke and even Winsor & Newton Professionals are really good to wet, and you can get really vibrant colour off of those. But I just prefer using the tubes. The problem with that is though, you might put out too much and it might turn into sort of like a pan pastel, a pan tube, a pan a pan watercolour anyway, because it's dried up and you don't want to waste it, so you can reuse it. And that's another thing that makes watercolour so unique and awesome, is that if you do let your paint dry or you buy already made panned watercolour, not pastel, watercolour, then it lasts you for a very, very long time. Obviously it depends on how many paintings you do, but I've had my watercolours for years and years and years, and I think that I'm going to have them for years and years to come, mainly because I tend to go on a big tangent and use different mediums. But even if you did use them quite a lot, they're going to last you a long time. So in the long run, they are less expensive medium to use because you can just use them over and over again and they don't dry out. So that's a good thing about watercolours that I enjoy. So I would suggest in investing in the best watercolours that you can at the time of purchase, because even though they seem expensive at the time, they're actually not that expensive, because if you bought say a £12 tube of acrylic, that's going to last you a lot less time than a £12 tube of watercolour. So there's a comparison, you decide, but I do suggest that you buy the most expensive brand that you can afford at the time. Another tip that I would like to share with you is that I really found it quite fun, also quite telling, to use just one colour of watercolour. It doesn't have to be black or like a monochrome colour, like a really dull colour. It can be any colour you want, but it really tells you about the paint itself, how it reacts to water, how it reacts to the page on the paper, how it reacts to a diluting, so how much water you need to make it really, really light, and how much water you don't need to make it really vibrant, and just the effects of the watercolour, whether it granulates or not. And that also gives you a good gauge on how to get value in your work. Value is really important and contrast is really important, so it teaches you how to go from dark to light and light to dark and have midtones and all these different ranges to try and make the artwork look nice, basically. One thing that I don't get along with in watercolour, but is very important apparently, is that leaving the whites of your paper is good for highlights, and it makes your paintings look less flat, and it's an easy way to get luminosity in your artwork, because you can have the white of the paper showing through, and it kind of just creates that vibe. Because if you mix white watercolor with with other colors in watercolor, it kind of muddies it down, makes it look a little bit milky, not very nice. I mean, you could do that if you're going for that, but I would suggest that you use gouache instead of doing that, because that's a good thing. But I don't want people to feel ashamed of using either gel pen, which I wouldn't really recommend. I would probably recommend gouache or acrylic, or even white ink is a good way to get highlights if you want to not worry about leaving white, because it is a really hard skill to master, but it does make your paintings look really nice. I would say that is the better way to go, but I always use gouache or acrylic or white ink to get the highlights of the paint coming through. A big tip that I have for you to do with watercolour is to use 2 containers or glasses or whatever you use. I actually use 2 old coffee jars for my water, and I use 2 because you can dip your dirty paintbrush in one of them, wipe it off onto kitchen roll or something like that and do that, and then you can dip it into your other container of water and your water will be clean. So that will be for clean water to put into your paints so that they don't contaminate each other, and that's a much better way to go. Another thing is that you don't need many colours to get started, and it's less overwhelming since you can mix colours together and make a lot of different colours and make your pieces look more cohesive. So you can buy 3 paints. I would suggest 4, maybe 5, and I would suggest a yellow, a red, a blue, a burnt umber or burnt sienna, and a darker colour, like what's it called? I can't remember what it's called, but a darker colour. And then you can mix all the different colours in the world. It's really easy to get different tones and colours with watercolour. And my last tip is that colour charts are a must. Once you get your paints, sit down. I actually have a video on how to make a mixing chart if you want to go and see that. And you're going to have to get out a big chunk of time to be able to do this, and just play with your paints, mix them, Like I said, I'll teach you how to do it in that other video, but colour charts are really handy to know what kind of colours to mix to get what colour and what kind of colours look like what on the paper. And please do use the same paper to mix on that you are going to use to do your final painting, because the paint looks different on different types of watercolour paper. And I think that's it. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you have any other watercolour tips, please comment them down below. Please remember to comment, like and subscribe. Like I said, if you haven't already, if you have, thank you so much for your support. Please remember to hit the notification bell as well if you haven't already too, so that it notifies you of all the videos that I post, and I will see you next time. Bye.